Welcome back, everyone, to the closing session of Agenda 2025, Free Ops Conference on developing the equal opportunity free enterprise agenda for the president who's inaugurated in 2025. And the reason why we picked the name Agenda 2025 is because it's going to take several years to bring everyone together around this set of ideas that we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks. And I am so excited about this closing session panel. We are joined by Jonathan Blanks, a visiting fellow at FreeOp, Laura Maristani of the Democracy Fund, Daniel Garza of the Libre Initiative, Margaret Hoover of Firing Line on PBS and many other ventures, and also John Ward, the senior political correspondent of Yahoo News. And we're going to talk today about how to get the two-party system we have to compete for every American support and to compete for the interests of every American with a focus on the GOP. And why are we going to focus on the GOP? Well, I think it's apparent to most people who follow politics that the GOP is the party of the two that has the biggest problem with diversity and reflecting the broader population of the country. And I'm just going to walk you through some data on this that I'll pull up here that many of you have seen if you've been through the entire Agenda 2025 session. But for those who haven't, I just want to go through it. Now, you've heard some people say that Donald Trump did better in 2020 with minorities than he did in 2016, and that's true. For all the narrative about his racially polarizing rhetoric, alleged or not, depending on your point of view, he did improve his performance with Hispanics, going from 29% among Hispanics, 31 from 29% among Asians. Some people have claimed incorrectly that he's done better than any Republican nominee in the last 60 years. That's not true. George W. Bush in 2004 in particular did better than Trump. But look, he did do better. And you still see, however, particularly with Asians and also with the Latinos, that Republicans are not doing great. And as Hispanics and Asians become a larger part of the electorate, that's a problem. And I would argue that problem really goes back to 1964. The heroic story you hear in the conservative world about Goldwater, the true blue conservative who won the nomination over the pusillanimous Nelson Rockefeller. The Rockefeller Republicans has been like a kind of a swear word in Republican circles. And yet on one really important issue, Goldwater was wrong and Rockefeller was right. And that's the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Goldwater was the nominee for president, and he campaigned against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, whereas Rockefeller and the Rockefeller Republicans in Congress were the ones who got that bill over the finish line and over to Lyndon Johnson's desk. George Will said this was a great moment, the 1964 election where Goldwater lost. It was the moment in which, while Barry Goldwater lost 44 states, except for Arizona and 5 states in the Deep South, he won the future. Well, this is the future that Barry Goldwater won for the Republican Party and the conservative movement, one in which the black electorate went from being overwhelmingly Republican to somewhat Republican to being almost entirely not Republican, to a point now where many black Republicans feel that if they express themselves as black Republicans, they're accused of being against their own race because of that legacy of Goldwater in 1964. And as time goes on and younger generations become a larger part of the electorate, younger generations being more diverse, the majority of births today in America are to non-white families, and evangelical Protestants become a smaller share of the electorate. So evangelicals, Republicans win something like 70 to 30, and the rest of the electorate, Republicans lose something like 60 to 40. This is no longer a formula for a competitive national party on the Republican side. And if you actually model this out, as some people at the Center for American Progress have done, and say, okay, what does the Electoral College look like if even if millennials and Gen Z become more conservative over time as they settle down and have mortgages to pay and have kids and get married, you still see states like Texas go into the blue column within about 10 to 12 years and eventually a fairly dominant Democratic Party. So the question is, can the Republican Party overcome this? Can the Republican Party attract more minorities, more non-religious people, particularly more non-evangelicals to the Republican Party, and therefore create a dynamic in which both parties are fighting for every vote? And we're going to start with Daniel Garza. Dan lives on the border with Mexico in one of those now famous border counties between Texas and Mexico that went heavily from being democratically oriented in 2016 to a lot more Republican oriented in 2020. Daniel, what happened?
Well, there was a massive shift in the political preferences of the Latino community here. And I'm going to tell you that I think a lot of it was organic. There was no Trump campaign team here. There was no marketing. There was no outreach. It was through word of mouth. It was folks who, like they say, good policy makes good politics. It was essentially, I think, Donald Trump's economic record that benefited South Texas tremendously, and Latinos responded to that. And it was also, I think, in response to bad policy that was being proposed by candidates on the center left, increase in taxes and regulations, Medicare for all, onerous Green New Deal that would be super expensive and wipe out energy development and fracking, which there are 400,000 jobs in Texas that depend on energy development. And that's a big deal. But a lot of it also had to do with the rejection of this cancel culture, this character destruction, the censoring, the violence in the streets that they saw. Antifa and BLM also were talking about dismantling the nuclear family, this anti-capitalism and Marxism that they were talking about. I think what's important to point out for a lot of folks is that Latinos are just as judicious, just as deliberate in making their political preferences, their choice when they go into the voting booth. And it's not because they were duped, they weren't manipulated. They made a choice. Is my life or the life of my family gonna be better if I vote for this person or that person? And so policy matters at the end of the day for Latinos. It always has and always will, but you have to connect with them and you have to relate with them. And I think the last thing I'll say to that is that the messenger matters too. If there are people like their neighbor talking to neighbors, and that's why I was talking about being organic in Florida, talking about socialism, all these kind of things that Latinos were talking amongst themselves. There's a trust in their neighbors, in the people that they go to church with, their friends, their colleagues at work. There's not so much trust in the party. There's not so much trust in the media. And so I think that's where a lot of Latinos were getting their messaging from, was from themselves. And it was very organic here in South Texas, I can tell you.
And let me just ask you a follow-up to that, Daniel. You were a critic of Trump in 2016. How did it make you feel? Did you feel conflicted? Like, what was it like for you personally, being in the middle of this maelstrom, I guess you could say?
Yeah, I mean, I had a resistance because, of course, Donald Trump, his style was uncouth, to say the least. A lot of what his rhetoric was cringy, and then, of course, he hadn't governed before. He had no record. And these past 4 years, I mean, I got to say, I was impressed with how he governed, which was in a very free market, conservative, pro-growth approach to his governing style. And I honestly, it was it turned my concept of who I thought Donald Trump was. And so I voted for Donald Trump again in 2020, just so you know, and my entire family and my extended family, mainly because now of his governing record, not just so much of what was a rejection of what I felt was going to be Hillary's policies. And I think a lot of Latinos did the same. There is no silver bullet, obviously, to reach Latinos. The one thing I'll say to that is, yes, we are a block of 20 million voters, but we're also a group that just shares an ethnicity and maybe a language. Other than that, we're 20 million individual voters who have policy preferences, whose ideas vary, whose principles vary, whose American experience varies too. So you have to come at us as individuals also. And like I said, the best way to do that is by messengers who we relate with.
That's a great point. Well, Laura, how about you? So you have roots in the other center of the action location, which is South Florida. Tell us about your take on what happened in this election and how it relates to the future of the Republican Party's relationship with Latinos.
Thanks, Avik. Great to be here with friends to talk about these things. I mean, and Florida is interesting because I kind of feel like at some point during the election results, there was somebody on NBC saying, how wasn't it possible that the Puerto Ricans were canceling out the Cubans? And I'm actually both, which, so it was kind of weird that I was being asked, like, how one of my communities wasn't canceling the other one. Not very cool. But, Daniel just talked about neighbors, and the answer in Florida is those neighbors are also produced by organizations that have infrastructure in those communities, organizations that are investing day in and day out in engaging with those potential voters. And, I think Daniel and the Libre Initiative are a really good example of that. They're an organization that has been on the ground for many years, engaging voters in those states, and you can see the results. And you can also see in other states where Democrats invested in building that kind of sustainable infrastructure, like in Arizona and Colorado, and the effects that it had in those states. Florida they just weren't in there long enough. So I think, to that comment, yeah, it's very powerful to have neighbors investing in your community that you can listen to. Now, what are we learning about Latino engagement in this cycle? I mean, long-term investments, again, really important. Can Republicans survive with the current strategy? They can probably survive for a little bit anyway. The party could continue to win non-diverse communities. There's a pathway in several states to electoral success that involves really just doing 5 to 10 points higher among non-educated college voters. That could keep some form of this party afloat for about 4 more cycles. And like you mentioned, Avik, maybe until 2036. Basic demographic changes in the country will naturally bring more diverse people to the parties as well. Latino shifts could reorient the maths towards conservatives, as we're seeing coming out of this election. And to Daniel's point, right? Like, we're not a monolith. We all come from different experiences and we're individuals. So does that actually mean that the party should continue its current strategy, as the title of this session suggests? I'm not so sure, because if the vote choices stayed at the current levels, the country will continue to skew Democrat. And you know what? There's another piece of this, which is a big piece of this conversation today. We hyper focus on diversity. We hyper focus on making sure that the coalitions look a certain way. The fact is that we don't need to struggle with diversity. America's already diverse. We know how to do diversity. We know how to get people in through the door. What we need to learn is how to be more inclusive. How do we create spaces for more inclusive decision-making? People, Latinos and other voters, are tired of folks coming in and just pushing our policy priorities down their throats. So, that concept of neighbors is going to radically shift how organizations that engage at the community level are doing it. And we're not going to be able to have a movement that reflects what Americans want unless it's able to actually bring those folks into the conversation, into the development of strategies.
Great. With that, let me say that for those of you who haven't done one of these sessions before, if you want to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window, or you can tweet us at #Agenda2025. Now I'm going to go to Jonathan Blanks. Jonathan, you give an annual talk at the Cato Institute, where you used to work before you joined FREOP, about the history of the libertarian movement and race and the friction that sometimes arises thereof. So give us your take on what you saw out of the 2020 election in terms of the improvement performance, particularly with Black men, and in general, how do you see these movements evolving on the topic?
Thanks, Ovik. So one of the things that I bring up in the talk is that Republicans used to do very well with Black people. Black people, when my father was growing up, this guy right here, when he was growing up, the two things that he was expected to do is honor his mother and vote Republican. And he kept with that throughout his life. He was running for sheriff in Allen County, Indiana, where I'm from, in 1980 as a Republican. But most of the family had shifted by that point, and you saw in Ovid's graphic at the beginning that massive decline, and it really did. While Black voters started going to the Democrats en masse during FDR, it wasn't so just absolutely vehement among Black people to not vote Republican until Barry Goldwater. And the thing is Barry Goldwater, I think, was a principled man. And he was against segregation, but he ran against the Civil Rights Act. And I think libertarians have long done this intellectual exercise of coming up with this non-racist way to defend policies that entrench the racial hierarchy that the conservative movement has latched onto. And so what we've seen in the recent past is like, some outreach to Black communities. And yes, Trump did a little bit better this year, but like, just like the Latino community, the Black community is also very diverse. There isn't really a community per se. We have different backgrounds. Growing up in the Mississippi Delta is different than growing up in Chicago, even and which is different than growing up in California. And so, but the voting Black pattern has sustained for so many years because the Republicans have too often made race an issue. It's a culture war issue. Before with Lee Atwater, where he's like, well, we're not going to run around saying the N-word, but we're going to say states' rights and busing and that sort of thing. Then John Ehrlichman talked about how basically Nixon's war on drugs was a way to criminalize the anti-war left and Blacks. This was something that has been long policy within the Republican Party. And so what used to be their most loyal base has effectively evaporated. But that doesn't mean there aren't any Black conservatives. And so I think Trump made some inroads there. He was very boisterous, and he projected, and he's an incumbent. And so, and you've seen the other in other years, incumbents still do a little bit better with Republican incumbents still do a little bit better. So I don't think there's any like great magic that he's doing here. And I think, we all know Black conservatives within the families that will sometimes vote, outside of the block, but it's not something I think is sustainable without a considerable shift in the Republican strategy.
What would that shift involve in your mind? Like, what would it take for the Republican strategy to be different? Is it a policy issue? Is it a tone issue? What is it? If Tim Scott were the 2024 nominee for president from the Republican side, would that make a difference?
I think it would make a difference. I don't think he'd probably get majority of the Black vote. I think it's possible, but it would really take a complete shift. Because we've seen in the past 4 years under Trump, the culture war has kicked up again, right? It's never really stopped, but the vitriol against Ta-Nehisi Coates that became like the vitriol against the 1619 project, you can have complaints with it. I certainly do, but that is, but the fact that they've concentrated that and they worked so hard on, pushing against critical race theory and that sort of thing, that is the same culture war stuff that Lee Atwater was doing, that the Nixon administration was doing. It's just a continuation since Goldwater, even though like libertarians meanwhile, they're like, hey, we tried, we're for school choice. We want, people to, have better access given the situations that we have and that sort of thing. And there is purchase there, but if it means voting along the Republicans who continue to bash Black people who ever say, hey, this country hasn't always been so great for us, I don't think is going to be a winning strategy going forward.
Well, that's a great lead into John Ward. So great you could join us, John, because, I'm such a fan of your work in general, but one of the things that you've done that's been so powerful to read and to listen to are your interviews with and your discussions with and your writing about the new wave of evangelicals who are trying to confront particularly Southern evangelicals trying to confront the relationship between Southern Protestant denominations and segregation and slavery. And kind of the flip side of that is maybe the trend among certain evangelical communities to move more left politically and vote more democratically. So the two questions I have for you are, one, tell us about your work in this area and what you're seeing in terms of that shift on racial reconciliation. And secondly, is it something we should take for granted that white evangelical voters will stay with the Republican Party? Is that something that could change or will change over time?
Hey, Vic. Yeah, I don't have a crystal ball on this. And I think after the 2016 election, when we saw, pretty, I think Nap Nasworth, who was at the Christian Post, has done some good work talking about, he left the Christian Post actually because of his disagreement with their support, kind of open support for Trump. But he's done some work talking about, I believe it's him who talked about the 2016 primary, where I think there was a lot of white evangelical support for Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and some other non-Trump candidates. And his argument would be that evangelicals were not originally drawn, or probably a majority of white evangelicals were not originally drawn to Trump in 2016, maybe kind of like what Daniel described, but coalesced, when it became a binary choice between him and Hillary Clinton. So I think after that experience, I'm not going to make broad predictions about what white evangelicals are going to do politically. But I think if you're going to see a shift, it's going to be among younger white evangelicals. And I think it'll be a minority. But I do think that there are elements of cracks in the foundation of the chokehold that the Republican Party has had on the white evangelical vote through the issue of abortion. You can argue it both ways. There are arguments that could be made to say Trump delivered on Supreme Court justices and on the judiciary in general, and that he'll be rewarded for that going forward. But the counter argument is that Trump's entire personality, his ethic or lack of one, his behavior, his personal immorality, all of that undermines a more comprehensive and coherent ethic of life, and has turned off a significant number of younger white evangelicals. And you did see some of this happening this year in the ways that some white evangelicals began to talk about abortion, where they were discussing the issue, first of all, through the lens of, we have been sort of told we have to vote Republican no matter what, based on this one issue. And how far does that bargain take us? How much do we have to put up with under that bargain? And I think there was just more discussion of the nuances of the abortion issue, talking about the fact that abortion has gone down under Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, talking about ways to prevent abortions and not just criminalize it through Democratic policies, stuff like that. So, that was one small sign of a potential move away from Trumpism among white evangelicals. I think, though, if you had somebody like Tim Scott or Nikki Haley or Marco Rubio or Josh Hawley, who really wears his religion on his sleeve, as the nominee in 2024, I think that would lock back in a lot of white evangelicals, to be honest.
Okay. With that, let's go to Margaret. Margaret, you on your relatively new show, you've been doing it for a couple of years now, Firing Line, the resuscitation of the great Bill Buckley tradition. You've interviewed so many of these newsmakers, both politicians and thought leaders in both the conservative and progressive movements. What's your take on where they are? Do you see leaderships, in the case of the Republican Party, that's really thinking hard about how to move away from some of the polarizing or exclusive approaches of the past? Can they do it without facing a primary challenge? You're on mute, by the way.
First of all, it's wonderful to see you, Ovik, and thank you so much for facilitating this conversation. It's great to see old friends here, and wonderful to have this conversation. A conversation that, Ovik, you and I have had some version of for probably more than a decade, and have, I think there's a short answer and a long answer to your question. The one person that I see on the national scene who is a Republican, who I think would very much understand the comments and the perspective of all of the speakers before me, John, Laura, and Dan, and who has had real success, not Donald Trump 2020 success, but real success. Because can I just like parenthetically be very clear here? Donald Trump's success in 2020 is not the formula for the future of the Republican Party if it wants to remain a competitive party in the future. All right, like this notion that like this was a win, and Dan Garza, like absolutely, and there was things that I think actually you articulated very well happening with part of the Mexican vote in Texas that caused many people's heads to turn, and as well Laura in Florida, many people's heads to turn and to think twice. And I think you actually articulated what was happening there very well. Largely, this is not a winning strategy. Okay, a president of the United States or a leader of a party who's signaling to white nationalists and Proud Boys, explicitly, is just not going to be the formula that is going to carry. It's not going to be the moral formula for the future of any party. But it's just not a winning strategy. It's also not a party that many people will have any interest in continuing to belong to from the next generation up. Take Millennials downward. The one person I have so much to comment on the previous panelists, but Larry Hogan, the Republican governor of Maryland, who actually in a broad national academic survey of governors was the first most popular governor in the country. And the second and third were Charlie Baker and Phil Scott. And what the three of them have in common is that they are Republican governors in blue states. And what they have figured out how to do, I mean, Larry Hogan won 30% of the African-American vote in his reelection. But in May, when Maryland tracked with a high degree, a huge sample size, his popularity and his approval rate amongst every cohort of his, of Maryland, of the population of Maryland, he actually had a 79% approval rating from African Americans and a 78% approval rating from white voters. All right, so this is a man who has, and as we know, he beat Ben Jealous, the former head of the NAACP, in his reelection, right? And so this is somebody who has, on the national scene in the Republican Party, decided that, like 16% is not good enough. Or 20% isn't good enough. And, improving African Americans from 8 to 12% at a national level, that's not a win. Like that's an rounding error. Okay. Like if we're going to be serious about actually winning African American votes in a meaningful way, and Jonathan and Ovik, I fundamentally agree. I think all of us who really looked at this agree that, we go back to 1964. It's pretty clear. There's not a lot of debate about why this is, but it's getting a party that's going to actually seriously want to contend with winning African Americans. And I think the way you want to win African Americans is to be serious about policies. And so we should talk about what some of those policies are, but this is not, I just want to dispel this notion or this myth that this is a myth of just communicating our ideas in a better way or having
a messaging problem.
Right. This isn't a messaging problem. This is a policy problem. And it's a policy problem because we haven't cared to do the thing that Laura talked about, which we do sometimes, right? Which is be inclusive and to ensure that, panels like this look like the country and the party, frankly, looks like the country. When I walk the halls of the White House, I've had 2 or 3 occasions to be in the executive office building in the Trump White House. I've seen no one black, right? Like, and so it's like the party and all the staff and every table and behind the doors, everybody, we have to look like the country. And the party has to look like that if we're going to include, truly be inclusive and have, like you said, Laura, voices at the table that represent the whole country. So there are some people.
What did Ben Hogan do? Like, tell us about that. So how did he get that 79% approval rate?
Several times he talks about it. Look, yeah, you go there. I mean, this isn't rocket science. Daniel Garza, it's what you said. You go, I mean, and Ovik, you even mentioned this in your Forbes column, right? Like when you go to untraditional places and you talk to untraditional communities of support, you build new bridges. And that's what Larry Hogan's done. He's built trust and built real relationships, and he's meaningfully delivered to communities that Republicans just hadn't needed to. Look, he's a Republican in a Democratic state. If he didn't win 30% of the African American vote, he wouldn't have won. But and so it's necessity is the mother of invention. But if we were sincere as a national party about really wanting to expand that 16% to 30%, or that, or 35%, right? Why not be bold? But that's what Larry says. The first thing he did is just going to communities, building real relationships, listening, and then sitting down at the table and delivering. Great.
Well, we got our first question here, so I'm going to throw it out there for whoever wants to take it. And it's effectively a variation of it's the economy, stupid. Do you think that the Democratic Party failed because it made it about personality? Biden's a good guy, Trump is a bad guy, and going back to normal on COVID as a central message, instead of making kitchen table issues like healthcare, unemployment, and things like that more central. What do you think about that? Does anyone have a take on that? Is that the secret or the mistake that Dems made? I mean, it seems that way from what you hear voters say, that the voters who, like, for example, some of the interviews that have been done in South Texas, Daniel, in your neighborhood, people say that, hey, I may be Latino, but I work, I work in the energy industry, or, the people who are concerned about defund the police, et cetera. Like, go ahead.
I almost think that the surge of Latino voters in the Rio Grande Valley and even in Ohio, in Georgia, in Florida, in political preferences towards the center right, was in spite of Donald Trump, as Margaret was talking about, because that's exactly right. It was about the economy. It was about the policies that Latinos were benefiting from, while Democrats were talking about the Green New Deal and all this other stuff on the street that was going on that Latinos did not relate with. There is a division in America right now. And it's very much the urban, college educated, mostly white elitists who look down on the rest of America and resent them for their faith, for their patriotism, and for the freedoms that they cherish, like the Second Amendment and pro-life issues. And it's that second group that feels resented, who are mostly rural, non-college educated, working class, who will not cede their freedoms and will fight and defend for them, right? And there seems to be this division, and Latinos are actually relating more and more to the second group. And so, yes, so when you're talking about it's the economy, they're fighting for opportunity, for access to the marketplace. And so they're listening to BLM and they're listening to Antifa, who want to crush the free market system, capitalism, opportunity, in the name of racism or ending racism. Are you kidding me? We actually want to expand access to the free market system, empower parents to choose the kind of education that they want for their children, not some politician to dictate it for them. They want to be able to keep their employer-based healthcare or their private insurance. But yes, of course, they also want to make sure that the poor Latino or the vulnerable community who has no access has access to healthcare too. But don't destroy mine in the process. So all these things matter to them because it is about, will my life be better? And so I think when we're listening to politicians as minorities, does this guy care about me? That's the number one thing. And number two, do his or her ideas work? And if you can get across those two messages, Latinos are going to respond. Well, I think one of the best examples of this is Will Hurd in District 23, who didn't run this time around, but Tony Gonzalez, took his seat now. This was a Black Republican challenger in a 75% Latino district who took out a Latino incumbent. Now think about that. Latinos voted against a Latino who was leftist, who was left of center, because Hurd connected on these issues, on economic issues. He went to where they're at, like Margaret was talking about. So important to have that. Look, I think Laura is absolutely right. You need that permanent presence. You need that infrastructure. You need Libre. We need those US or whatever these organizations that are bringing out the vote. But if the leadership that's been elected is not passing good policy that is creating a benefit to the community, I can't help you as an organization. I need to tie good policies that work to the leader, that we're going to promote or endorse or or otherwise we're going to oppose you. So it is at the end very much about good policy. I'm convinced of that.
I go to John Ward here.
I'll
John, yeah, go ahead.
Like, I just wanted to add really quickly. I mean, I agree that it is about, you know, where folks are leaning, and obviously Latinos and other communities care about all issues, not just some. But there's also kind of this dynamic where a lot of folks voted against something, not really for something else. And there isn't quite a lot of clarity too, as we think about, you know, what is it that the conservative movement is rallied around at the moment. There isn't a lot of clarity around what that is. So what is clear when we look, you know, to down ballot races is that a part of that is certainly what folks are voting against, not necessarily that they're voting for something.
John Ward, you have, you know, you talk to a lot of Democratic strategists, operatives, policymakers, politicians. What's the Democrats' assessment of the lessons to be learned from the last couple of weeks?
Well, you saw it play out a little bit, you know, the division with the, there was a big New York Times article, I think, with Connor Lamb, you know, Pennsylvania, you know, swing district Democrat, and AOC basically going back and forth. You know, I think AOC's critique was, I think, generally, even among Democrats, panned. The critique being that, you know, Democrats who lost didn't have a good digital strategy. That's just not a serious critique. And, you know, most people who have experience in politics make no bones that, like, message and candidate quality are the two top issues that drive campaigns, and that, you know, digital strategies make a difference in close races, but are not determinative. But, you know, there was a good John Harris column in Politico that talked about how there was a memo from a group of progressive organizations that did talk about a message solution where they were trying to fuse racial justice rhetoric and policy with economic policy. And I do think that's at the heart of one of the challenges facing the Democratic Party. Joe Biden did not run on defunding the police. He categorically rejected it. You know, he was pretty consistent in condemning violence that took place alongside peaceful protesting during the summer after George Floyd's murder. And I think, you know, I think a lot of what Daniel said about some of the ways that people perceive politics was a bunch of caricatures, but that is a lot of how politics works, through caricatures. I would not take issue, but I would say that I think the characterization of Black Lives Matter as a Marxist organization, I can't judge people's intent when they say that, but I think most people who advocate for Black Lives Matter are advocating for the sentiment, for the principle. And it does seem to me like the attempt to paint it as an organization with a clear hierarchy and a statement of principles that are widely shared is an attempt to sort of diminish the broader principles that I think many Americans have come to see as important, especially after Floyd's death. But I do think that the Democrats have a challenge in the sense that, you know, if there's no clear organization and leadership to BLM, that also leaves a vacuum. And so people who do have views that are too far left for many Americans can step in and be seen as representing that movement. And that is the nature of collective action in our current day. Like, we don't have a lot of functioning institutions. We don't have ways to act collectively in the age of, you know, social media and individualized platforms and chasing likes rather than, you know, collective action. So that's kind of my thoughts on that.
That's great. We have a question from Matthew Wilson that I may actually ask you to pipe in on as well, John Ward, but anyone else pipe in as well if you've got thoughts on it. So how can Republicans get their message out effectively through traditional channels? And that's why I go to you, John, as our resident MSM member here. When those traditional channels have a bias against them, you can't talk about record minority wage growth or record low minority unemployment if you aren't asked about it? That's the question.
And the question is about media bias. I wasn't sure the first.
Yeah,
part of
I
that.
guess the question I guess is if the media is biased against Republicans and is not predisposed to cover the good news stories of how Republican policies are benefiting minorities, how do Republicans do a better job of engaging and attracting minority votes and being more inclusive?
I'll try to be as concise as possible because I could ramble on forever on this question. I think on the second half of the question, I think that most of Republican challenges with minorities, not all, but most, are the fault of the Republican Party, not the media. But I do think that the media has, had a huge challenge on its hands during the Trump era and has failed in many ways. I think the media has, and the media is a big term, right? Which it's not a precise term. I think the media has done a lot well, but I do think there's a lot of merit to the idea that Trump has gone so far to bait the media, and I think the media has often taken that bait by making too much a negative and too much about being critical, and not enough, I think, just about being more even keeled in the way that we talk about his behavior, his policies, and what the media focuses on. A lot of this, I feel like, does come from, the programming model of cable TV. That's more moment-to-moment focus and less policy focus, less focused on actually addressing the challenges that face everyday Americans. But I think you look at the Russia story, it was just relentlessly hyped, and I'm not even going to get into the endless details of the way that the FBI and intel community handled that. I'm actually going to be interviewing Eli Lake this coming week, who's been kind of out there doing a lot of pretty good reporting from a very critical point of view about Crossfire Hurricane. And we're going to talk about, what were the ways that law enforcement, intel, and the press made mistakes. How can we be, clear-eyed about those, and how can we compare them to what is happening right now with the Trump's, with the president's refusal to recognize a legitimate election? We're going to kind of talk about both of those things, because a lot of people who are trying to deny President-elect Biden's legitimacy are trying to use stuff like the Russia story to justify that. And I think we want to be, again, clear-eyed about what happened with the Russia story, but also make clear that that's not an apples to apples comparison.
Margaret, you're also in the media ecosystem. You have any thoughts on this topic? How Republicans get their message out?
I do.
You talked about a little bit already. You talked about a little bit already, saying it's not a messaging problem.
The specific question was about the media reporting wage growth and earnings increases in the context of what had been a very successful economy prior to COVID. And I mean, I work at CNN, CNN did that story, and, a lot of places did that story. So it's not like it wasn't covered, but it also shouldn't be, the lead story on the front of every newspaper multiple days in a row or multiple months in a row. Like, it's a story, right? But it's not, yes, is there bias in the media? Of course there are biases in the media. We know that. Like, I don't actually think it's that dramatically different than it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago, other than the fact that there are many more tributaries for the media. The tentacles of the media stretch all the further with social media. The recurrence, I've actually lost a little bit of patience, even though I know that bias exists. Like, I've lost a little bit of patience for the constant criticism from the right for the media, as though it's all the media's problem and not at all. There's no responsibility on the part of the Republican Party to actually reach out, build our coalition, and frankly just perform better, right? Like, it's like blaming, let's just do better, and then or be better, and then you don't have to point fingers, because it just falls on deaf ears at a certain point.
Yeah,
Most-
Daniel, you're often on Univision. You deal with challenging questions about conservative philosophy all the time from your Univision co-panelists. Tell us about that. What's that experience like for you, and how do you feel it goes getting that message, the free market
Well,
message out, let's say?
Absolutely, there is bias in the media. I mean, I think the media has lost so much credibility in these last 4 years for so many people, both on the left and the right. And there's guilty parties on both sides. And on Spanish language television, there's no question that it tilts center left, and you're going to be outnumbered if you go on a panel, and the questions that you get are going to be charged. They're going to be antagonistic, and the questions to the left are going to be protagonistic. I know Margaret doesn't want to hear that, but
I agree with you. I think actually Spanish language media, I think, is even more biased. I think in some ways.
It really is, but that's fine. I think if you are a person who is entering this arena and you're going to depend on the media to get your message across, you're insane.
That's part of the problem, right? You're not talking to the actual voters.
Right, that's part of the problem, right? Exactly. Your expectations are way off, right? What you need to do is as I talked about, there's no silver bullet to reach the Latino community. It's the same for every other constituency. We have what we call the multi-layered approach. Of course, you're going to be part of the conversation in Spanish language and English language, on print, radio, digital, television, across the spectrum. We have 1 million followers on Facebook, so we can drive a conversation like that, or Twitter, or the other apps that all the young kids are into. But we go door to door. We make the phone calls to the fellow Latinos through our massive database of the voter files that we have that is deep and extensive. We send them mailers. We're on their computers through digital ads. We do events in person, and we do this kind of stuff, panels to get the message across, because you got to cut through the noise. You got to connect with people, and there is no one way you do it. And it certainly is exclusively the media. So again, if you think that that's how you're going to get your message across, it's going to come through distorted and sometimes very opaque. So take control of your narrative and use a multi-layered approach.
Laura, doesn't this tie in really well with your whole point about inclusive decision making, that you've got to have people making the decisions who are, who can directly connect to various communities?
Yeah, and they also need information. And I think it's very dangerous when leaders themselves kind of cancel out the media, because canceling out is happening on many different sides. And, I think it's a little bit more constructive to think about, how do we fix it, right? Like, if that is such a pervasive problem, then our leaders, all of us and others, should actually be working to figure it out instead of amplifying it and sowing distrust in communities. Because again, if we don't have those methods to communicate information, it's not only really dangerous in terms of democratic norms, but it's also not helpful to all of the work that folks here are trying to do to get information out to communities. Certainly, we can't have more inclusive decision making if people don't understand what is actually happening in their communities. And just to take it down a notch, like, one of those really dangerous things that has happened in recent years is that people don't have information about their own communities because local journalism is pretty much dead. And so, I think that's another place where, when we're thinking about what is the future of the conservative movement, we need to think about what are the mechanisms that we are going to use to spread that healthier future. And local journalism is a really important part of that. When you look at a lot of the voters that, were in so many communities during the recession, that closed out, like, local journalism went away with that as well. And they're seeing what's happening in communities that are 4 or 5 hours away. It's impossible to understand what kind of decisions you need to be making for your community and the future of your kids when you literally cannot see and don't know and don't have access to information about what is happening there. And so you're planning for the future of, what's happening in New York City, where you may be in the Midwest. So, a lot of structural problems that we need to deal with, but I don't think it's constructive, on our part as leaders in this space to kind of continue to dig into how do we sow distrust in the institutions that we have in place to help folks connect to their democracy.
Jonathan Blanks, you've been vocal about saying that these days you don't feel either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party reflects your values in terms of being both pro free enterprise and pro racial inclusion. If a Republican candidate for Congress or Senate or governor or president came to you and said, Jonathan, I'm a huge fan of your stuff, tell me what I need to do, what would you tell him or her?
Echoing what's already been said here is like, go into the communities and listen to what people have to say. I remember several years ago, Rand Paul went to Howard University and tried to do some Black outreach. Was for a Republican was kind of, wow, that's nice. But he went in with this attitude that was very, hey, it's you guys used to be with us, but it's not us, it's you, but we forgive you and we want you back in the party, without doing any work whatsoever. And it was absolutely maddening. He basically was run out on a rail there. And so if there's going to be outreach, it has to be sincere. And I think that, what Margaret said was earlier was right. It's like Hogan has gone out. He goes into the communities. He knows what these people want. And he's not always going to do what they like, but he respects them and he has a connection with them. And unfortunately, I think the Republicans have continued to write off the Black community. And the idea that they are not going, they don't want to learn. It's like there's a group of people within the Republican universe that want, like Michael Steele and others have tried to make this. But if you're going to focus so much on the culture wars and you're going to make such a big deal about 1619 and all these other things and not actually deal with the police problems that we all recognize are going on, and you're just going to use that to try and drive more white resentment, then yeah, you're not going to get anywhere.
Well, I want to follow up on that. And again, maybe anyone take this, but one of the things that I'm sure that we've all noticed at times is if you're somebody who has what we used to call a conservative point of view, or a free market, pro-liberty point of view, and you talk about issues of inclusion to people who have a more traditional conservative point of view, let's say, there are plenty of people who get mad about it, right? There are plenty of people who see it as an attack. If we call this panel the Grand Old White Party and we give it that title, there are people who feel attacked by that and see that as something to actively be angry about and opposed, because they see it as, hey, what about me? Like, don't I deserve to be part of the inclusion too? Is there a solution to that? Is there a way to make inclusion truly inclusive, in the sense of doing it in a way that makes white males, let's say, and maybe what we might call the classic Trump voters, feel also that they're part of the solution, part of the community, part of the group of people who need to be engaged?
I mean, I'll take a little bit of that one. For me, listen, I said it at the beginning, America is already diverse. And that doesn't mean that it's a bunch of Black and Latino people. It means we're diverse, right? Like, we have white people and Asian Americans and African Americans and Latinos and many different types of white people with many different stories. It doesn't mean we cancel all of those people out. But the thing is that we haven't figured out how to navigate in that diversity. And you can see it, right, from your table at work, where you may be with 3 of your colleagues, and it doesn't matter what they look like, you all have different stories. As Americans, as a global community, I think we haven't quite figured out, how do we maximize that diversity? How do we kind of implement some of our free market ideas to experiment with more effective collaboration in a way that we can bring out and all of those people into a negotiation for the better of our communities. And that's the part in this conversation, when we hyper focus on diversity, because we tend to do it because we know more about it. We know the tactics, and inclusion and making it work in a diverse table is complex, and it's going to require it being uncomfortable. And we're going to have conversations that make us uncomfortable. So on a human level, we kind of tend to gravitate towards what's going to be easier and what we know. And we don't know how to do inclusion well. We don't know how to do collaboration well. So like that's the work that I'm really interested in. I actually think that when I talk to conservatives on the ground, they get it. you know, the things that we hear when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion on the right, which is very rarely, but when you do hear it, you hear folks talking about, I want to make sure I'm at the table because people value my qualifications. I want to make sure I'm at the table because I worked my butt off to be at that table. And I know what I'm saying. And I don't want to be there because I checked the box. And we fall into that when some sides hyper focus on diversity. But the fact is that we have this craving. And so now we need to figure out, so what are the experiments to make it work? I think Margaret's program is a really good example of that. When we talk about these concepts of social cohesion and unity and belonging and bipartisan relationship building, what we're actually talking about is inclusion. How do we create spaces to have a conversation across difference?
You've made, a number of you have made this point about like the Will Hurd example or the Ben Hogan example of it's really just about bottoms up hard work of going in to talk to people and listen to them and hear what they care about. And if people felt heard, they feel included. Is that right, Margaret? Go ahead.
Well, I think it's that, Ovik, but I also think it's policies, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Look, I mean, I think certainly, you know, you can make a strong argument. I think our best argument, the Republican Party's best argument is an economic argument. But look, let's go back to the Rockefeller Republicans and just take a page from what they understood that the party after them didn't understand. And, you know, to me, it's nuts that we had one high profile Republican senator marching peacefully with the BLM, peaceful protests. All right. And that BLM still in the Republican Party amongst some groups is shorthand for burn the place down. Okay. Because after George Floyd, there was a real change and shift in this country about how ordinary, you know, not people who think and live and breathe politics, but regular Americans think about racial reconciliation and real systemic injustices that do exist in this country. And it can't be like un-Republican to talk about that or like unconservative to recognize that and to be able to engage with that. And then, you know, because we all, I mean, I do think, you know, from the perspective of conservatism, or at least a conservatism that we all sort of identified with 10 years ago, I think it's, you know, it's morphed in some places over the last 4 years and in the context of this president. But, you know, I have seen a real lack over the last 3 years of interviewing people on firing line. I just, when you look at the Democratic Party just is more diverse, right? There just are way more people of color, way more people with different experiences, way more, and the Republican Party has gotten increasingly whiter, it seems to me, at least when I'm, you know, amongst my peers and again, like walking the halls of the EEOB. And we've got to figure out a way, as you said, Ovik, to be able to engage with our history and to engage with like a real conversation about racial reconciliation that isn't threatening or doesn't follow sort of white identity politics or white grievance politics, and that can be, Laura, as you say, inclusive and non-threatening, and maybe really lead us to a place where the party can actually grow. But that's the country. That is the conversation the country is having. And it's being had in communities and in churches and in synagogues and in schools all over the country. And if the GOP can't have that conversation, then it's not going to be able to grow with the rest of the country. And it can't be, so we can't be mutually exclusive. It just can't. So I think it actually, what it comes down to is looking at policies, right? The police reform, you know, there are a lot of ways to approach police reform. And you know, Tim Scott, actually, I mean, we don't have to go into sort of what the Democrats did to Tim Scott as he, you know, earnestly wanted to bring forward a real police reform bill in the Senate. School choice, criminal justice reform. Man, I mean, I even think, you know, Jim Clyburn doesn't really like the idea of engaging with, you know, monetary reparations, but like he's going to sponsor the reparations commission just to review it, right? Like just engaging in these conversations, you know, to recognize that there's history and like that history didn't start in 1964, right? I just think is so much a part of it, Ovik.
And
Can I say one?
Yeah, please, both of you, John,
John-
and then John Ward, then John Blanks. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just real quickly, I think one sort of litmus test for us on issues that are like this, but especially on this issue of race, a good test is to look at who are people elevating to argue with? What kind of people are they engaging with? There's a lot of hucksters and bad faith actors in our politics and in our communications. And, I probably don't want to mention names right now because I'm probably biased in which side I'm going to hit harder on that. But I think we all just got to make an effort to elevate people from maybe the side we don't agree with, that are serious, that are making serious arguments, and to engage with those people, and to try to elevate the people from the point of view that we agree with that are serious too. And I would just point to somebody like, on the positive side, on the issue of engaging with our racial history and the issue of racial justice, somebody like Brian Stevenson.
Brian Stevenson, exactly.
Right? Like he
Yes.
is an example of somebody who is doing some very hard work and has done the hard work. If you haven't read his book, Just Mercy, go read it and then watch the film. He's doing the hard work. He's got the museum memorial to lynching in Montgomery, Alabama. Or is it Birmingham? I'm not sure. I think it's Birmingham.
In Montgomery.
Montgomery. And but he is not approaching this from a place of trying to extract revenge or make people feel guilty. He's trying to do it from a place of trying to help the country move forward. So I think that's just one thing we need to really put our shoulder to the wheel on.
Amen.
Great.
Yeah, and similarly, what my point was very similar to what John's was, is that I've often heard, the same things that lawyers talked about. Like people don't want to be tokenized. They don't want to be brought in just because I'm the Black person or I'm the Latino. But at the same time, unfortunately, when we do elevate people to have these conversations, too often, I think conservatives are going to find the Black conservatives that's going to tell them everything's okay. And that's not really engaging with the other side. That's not engaging with the people who disagree with you. It's like, oh, well, we found a Black person who actually agrees with us, and so it's fine. Everything, we don't have to do anything, right? And so it's just this trap that I think the conservatives haven't really learned how to engage yet in this particular respect.
Well, we've gone past. Please, Daniel. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to.
I'll try to be.
I was just going to say we've gone past the hour, but I do not want to close this session without everyone getting any final thoughts they have in, because I think it's been an incredible conversation. So please, Daniel, go ahead.
I appreciate it. Thank you. I think one of the brightest moments of the Trump administration was, and Margaret touched on it, was on criminal justice reform, and working with Van Jones, working with people across the aisle, bring them together and reach common ground and consensus on an issue that everybody agrees on. There is a two-tiered justice system. If you have title and position and money, you're treated one way. If you're a minority who doesn't have title or position or money, and even a white person who doesn't have money, you're treated a whole entirely different way. And that needs to be addressed. And this was the first step in resolving these kind of issues that reach at the very lives of people who are scraping their knees in prayer, just trying to get by another day, with the economy, and now having to deal with this justice system that is oppressive sometimes. And it was, like I said, one of the brightest moments for the Trump administration to do this, right, and to achieve legislation. And so that was a great opportunity to bring people together, to drive those conversations towards something that was productive. And I think immigration reform can be one of those issues. But right now, what's been so frustrating is that when we finally arrive at a point when someone drops legislation, it seems that both parties distance themselves away from consensus. And one of the things that has been very frustrating too, with the Democrat Party, is that you have candidates who tell you, vote for me, and I promise you immigration reform. Everybody votes for them, and then they don't achieve immigration reform. See, what they didn't tell you was, if you vote for me, I'll get you immigration reform as long as I get everything I want. And so that's been the frustrating part with folks on the right too. as long as they get everything they want. Well, that's the problem, is that in order to arrive at common ground and consensus, you have to drop a little bit of everything you want, right? And so we can move forward as a country and have the kind of conversation we had around criminal justice reform. Recognize what are the top priority issues that we're facing as communities and people, and deal with that issue instead of who's going to score political points. And I think that's just one of the infuriating parts about some policy. But it was to everybody's point, such a positive thing to see folks coming together on criminal justice reform, because they recognize that there was a solution that we could all embrace. And I just hope that one of I'll end with this. One of the things that I took away from the speech that President-elect Biden gave in accepting the vote, or whatever it was when he said that part of his mandate, he felt, was to reach across the aisle. And that's exactly right. I'm glad you said that, because that's what you're going to need to do. I think, folks are looking towards leadership, not just to make promises, but how are you going to work with the other side to arrive at progress on immigration, on economics, on education, on healthcare, on all these other issues. And I think a lot of us can help by being the bridge builders and welcoming people towards conversation, towards dialogue, and towards understanding.
Anyone else have any final thoughts?
I'll just, on that one, I think it's beautiful to think that we could go to a past where we could negotiate on legislation, on its merits, and on policy. But the challenge is that to this conversation, there are people that hold very important values around how they feel, the other side may be kind of thinking about racial injustices or racial inequity. And it's very difficult for you ultimately to say, I'm going to work with you on school choice issues when you're seeing that the person on the other side of that is supporting or behind a precedent that is calling for the Proud Boys to go after them, and that is seemingly supporting white supremacists. It's very difficult to reconcile that. And so when we talk about those new methods for coming together to negotiate on the legislative piece, we do need to have the racial injustice conversation, because people need to be able to reconcile those two things. I am not going to be able to work with you if ultimately I perceive that your ultimate values are to exclude people from our nation and to not promote a more inclusive one. So back to the original purpose of our conversation, I think that's at the core of what we need to try to figure out. Like, how do we navigate that?
Well, listen, I think we've there's so many takeaways from this conversation. Your point, Daniel, about people bringing people together and being bridge builders is obviously so important. The point about engaging directly with communities and not telling them what they should think, but actually going in and listening to the challenges facing, so important. I've heard a number of you say policy, economic policy, and public policy in general is so important. I mean, all of these things, of course, are things I love for people to say, because that's what we're trying to do here at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity is develop those policies. If you've missed any of the sessions from Agenda 2025, you can find them at agenda.freeop.org, including this one. You can go back and find our amazing conversation about criminal justice reform, about housing reform, healthcare reform. Go down the list. I think a lot there that really relates to these kitchen table issues that people of all persuasions, races, creeds, et cetera, face. I want to thank all of our amazing guests today for joining us. Everyone's so busy right now. I want to also thank Kara Jones and Haley Roddy and Tamara Thorne and Rachel Ledroot from our team for helping to organize this conference. Again, if you want to see any of the old episodes, go to agenda.freeop.org. In the new year, after the holidays, we're going to come back and have regular conversations like this, not every day, but maybe every couple of weeks. So you can stay tuned for more information about that. And if you want to support our work, you can also go to donate.freeop.org to do that. Again, I want to thank Laura, Daniel, Margaret, John Ward, Jonathan Blanks, and everyone who listened in today for these amazing conversations. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, Ovik.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.